Hi everyone, I'm Professor Miranda Stewart. I'm head of the tax law research program in the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law. Welcome to this seminar, part of our seminar series. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay my respects to elders past and present, which seems particularly suitable today, thinking of elders, also distribution, and also the Settlement Federation of Australia, all of which we're dealing with in the seminar. We've got Dr. Karen Strojek as our speaker today on the fascinating topic of whatever happened to Australia's inheritance taxes. One thing to note, of course, is that that's plural. We used to have a lot of them, and now we have none. Dr. Strojek's research has explored in depth the reasons why that happened, or at least some of the reasons why that happened. Dr. Strojek is in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at Trobe University here in Melbourne, political science, sociology, politics expert, and bringing that social and political science research approach to this topic, which is often considered as a matter of just tax law or sort of public policy reform or possibly failure. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Strojek.
So thanks very much, Miranda, for that very kind and generous introduction, and my thanks also to the Melbourne Law School for hosting this seminar. The presentation I'm giving to you today is based mainly on my fairly recent doctoral research into the history of Australia's inheritance taxes and the reasons why they were discontinued after having been in place for quite a long time. I'm going to run through some of my research methods. I'm going to discuss the main interest groups who were more affected by the taxes, and also explain some of the processes and events that led to the abolition of the taxes. And if there's time, I'd like to say something about feasibility reduction, given that that's a very current topic of today. So I just want to start by drawing a little bit of a boundary on this topic. And the question of whether governments should or should not tax the inherited wealth is a normative question, but it's an ongoing question that tends to raise some very heated arguments, sometimes very emotional arguments, and sometimes quite political. So I need to say at the start that the research that I do isn't designed to address that particular question. Rather, it just maintains a focus on historical past events and processes. And I also say that for anyone who wants to argue against or in favour of the reintroduction of the taxes, I think it's probably quite a useful thing to understand the reasons why it's disbanded. So we'll start with a little bit of historical background and contemporary understanding of what happened. Australia's pre-Federation colonial governments introduced a state of bequest tax between the 1850s and the 1890s. But they were mainly just simple revenue-raising measures, and the statutes were developed from English law. And because English law was developing quite quickly during the second half of the 19th century, the Australian statutes were also quite varied. The federal government then introduced a national estate duty in 1914 during the period of wartime fiscal crisis. And the dual level tax system then remained in place, changing only incrementally over the following 60 years until the middle of the 1970s. And then, over a relatively short period, they were abandoned in every jurisdiction. So, why did this happen? The most popular accounts go something like this. High inflation and lack of adjustment had made the taxes too burdensome, and farmers were angry about the heavy taxes imposed on the inheritance of family funds. In response to a strong farming lobby, the Queensland government abolished its CS duties, and then the other state governments, terrified of capital flight to other states, felt like dominoes and abandoned their own taxes as well. All right, the state governments were terrified of capital flight, according to the story, and they abandoned their inheritance taxes because they were afraid of people moving themselves and their capital to Queensland. Now, for some unknown reason, the federal government also abandoned, and some of the commentators put this down to political opportunism and a kind of request for political popularity, electoral popularity. So, as in many fondly recounted myths and folk tales, there are some fragments of truth in this story. But there are obvious inconsistencies and great to that down. And yet this account has been recirculated with very little critical attention for about the last 40 years. So to start to uncover the truth of what happened, my first preliminary task was to clarify exactly the timing of the audited process across all of the taxing jurisdictions, federal, 6 states and the territory. So this is a timeline of the main events. The process of abolition involved 3 main steps. First, intentions are announced, sometimes in budget speeches, sometimes in press releases, and sometimes as electoral promises through the media. Second, legislation was passed, and finally, the taxes were discontinued. You can see from the chart that this process was very quick in some jurisdictions, but much more lengthy in others. Sometimes multiple announcements were made and nothing happened for a long time. Sometimes legislation was passed and took effect retrospectively, and sometimes legislation was passed, but it still took a long time to phase up taxes. One thing that's really important to note here is that the very first full exemptions were applied to property passing to surviving spouses. Not partners, but surviving spouses, and most of those were female. This indicated that there was probably a gender element in the policy negotiations, and so this is something that's been completely left out of existing literature. So the second preliminary task was to clarify which political parties in power at the time the legislation was passed. So you can see from this chart that there were very strong policies at play. The first 4 jurisdictions to abandon completely were under coalition governments or combined party governments. And then those that followed were all under Liberal governments, with the exception of New South Wales. And if I have a bit of time, I'll explain why that particular anomaly happened. So a couple of things to note from this. First of all the major parties, except the Northern Territory, were willing to exempt property from the taxes. Second, with the exception of Queensland, no subnational government legislated full abolition until after the federal government had done so. So this indicates that we need to pay particular attention to intergovernmental relations within the federal system. I use both qualitative and quantitative methods to try to establish whether any particular interest groups were influential in the whole process. The qualitative research involves the examination of a really broad range of archival materials. Very useful were the submissions and some of the testimony before 2 major tax inquiries in the 1970s. One was the Senate Standing Committee on Finance and Government Operations and Death Duties, and the other was the Taxation Review Committee, which most of us think of as the ASPRO Committee. Lots of different people made submissions, and a lot of those were professionals who took a technical interest in the fairness, efficiency, and simplicity of the tax plan. They couldn't really be called activists. Generally, they were dissatisfied with the existing system, but they didn't represent the grievances about their treatment and wanted the taxes changed or abolished to help a particular social group. Those who did have grievances fell into 2 main categories. The first group complained about the disproportionate tax compliance burdens faced by women. The most prominent and effective of these were Western Australian Senator Sidney Negus and the Women's Electoral Body, particularly the Probate Action Group headed by the late Di Graham. Both of them argued for the exemption of marital property from the inheritance taxes, but not for the abolition. The second group comprised farmers and farmers' organisations who often worked in collaboration with the Country Party, the National Party. This group tended to argue for full abolition on the basis that the taxes were harmful to family farm enterprises, and most family farms were only inherited by men. So to identify what kinds of people actually contributed to tax revenue, I gathered together quantitative demographic data and tax data from a combination of sources, and then compiled them manually into a data set spanning from 1914 to 1988, the last year in which outstanding taxes were collected. Now, this data set is publicly available on an open source platform. The link is on the slide, and you can provide to help. Analysing this data allowed me to identify strong gender differences and strong occupational differences in taxes. Australian males owned significantly more assets at the time of death than Australian females. The information about marital status wasn't always recorded, but when it was significant. The majority of taxable deceased estates were left by people who were married at the time of death. Of those, only around 15% or less were left by women, and this indicated that married women owned a lot less property than married men. When we combined occupational and gross assets data, I found that the retirees were overrepresented in the bottom 50% of asset holders, so they were the most numerous but not the wealthiest. But in contrast, the farmers that left taxable deceased estates were strongly overrepresented in the top 10% of asset holders. And they contributed disproportionately large amounts of inheritance tax revenue in the states. The highest absolute numbers of taxable farm estates were located in New South Wales and Victoria, but the highest per capita concentration was in Queensland, followed by Western Australia. So we can see that the distribution of tax obligations wasn't just shaped by the wealth of donors, but also by their gender, their occupation, and their location. And some striking correlations come out of this. For example, among tax donors, Australia's poorest women lived and died in the jurisdictions with the highest per capita concentrations of farmers. The highest per capita concentration of farmers and poor women were in Queensland, followed by Western Australia. And I'll show you some numbers on this a little bit later. There were a lot of reasons why widow women faced more onerous tax compliance burdens than widow men. First of all, in most marriages, the husband died first. Australian women live longer than Australian men, and they still do. And Australian women usually marry men who were 7 years older. This meant that women most often had the responsibility of administering the deceased husband's estate and finding the money to pay taxes. Second, married women earned less and owned fewer assets than married men. That meant that a widow would usually inherit more from her husband than a man from his wife, and the tax would normally be higher. Women earn less than men owing to long-term gender bias in wage and employment policy. This dated back at least as far as the institution of the male regular wage in the Federation period, and it was exacerbated by the public service marriage bar, under which married women were not permitted to work in public service, and this applied at both federal and state levels. A working wife was usually classed as a secondary earner and taxed at a higher rate than other women. Now, many of you will know that when two people own property jointly, they don't just own half each. They both have full overlapping ownership rights of the assets. When one partner dies, the survivor doesn't inherit, they just simply continue on with the existing property rights that they had in the first place. But when the spouse died, jointly owned marital property was taxed as if the survivor had inherited it. In most jurisdictions, the survivor was obliged to pay inheritance taxes on 50% of the joint assets. But in some states, particularly New South Wales and Tasmania, Queensland to a lesser degree, the surviving spouse was obliged to pay, the joint property was assessed according to how much of their own money each of the partners had put into the assets. And this made tax compliance even more onerous for widows in New South Wales and Tasmania. All of this, as you can imagine, provided plenty of material for tax reform activists. Sid Negus began in Western Australia as a grassroots activist whose main concern was the welfare of widow women struggling with tax compliance after their husbands died. He was elected to the Federal Senate in 1970, and his election politicised the inheritance taxes and drew more attention to the unpopularity. The Women's Electoral Lobby ran the Probate Action Group in Sydney from 1974 to 1978. Diagram and her team wrote multiple submissions to government and hundreds of letters to state and federal parliamentarians. They thought that the inheritance tax was fair, but just once per generation, not twice per generation. All right, we'll probably skip through this fairly quickly. These are just the numbers that indicate male female differences in the number of taxable deceased estates, that is, those attracting federal estate duty and the gross assets at the time of death. The value of gross assets was usually done at state level to calculate state taxes, but these valuations were then normally accepted by the Commonwealth for the calculation of the federal estate duties. So the gross assets figures are the same at both levels of government. You can see that women's wealth increased over the final decade of the state unions, but was still consistently lower than men's. Now we're going to turn to what William Pedrick calls a farm problem. Landed assets, realty, are fixed in place and they're sometimes hard to divide. When the administrators of the seized estate had to pay taxes on the value of the farm and fixed assets and the liquid funds were insufficient, they sometimes had to sell the farm or subdivide it in order to pay the taxes. This could displace the members from their family home and destroy their livelihood. The evidence found this actually happening was only anecdotal and the extent of the problem is determined. But the farm problem certainly existed and its historical origins also go back to the Federation period. Before and after Federation, Australian governments were committed to populating what they saw as an empty country, what we now call terra economics, a concept which is quite widely fallen into disgrace. They did this by initiating closed settlement schemes, subdivision of land into very small farm holdings. Around 30,000 sort settlers and an additional 150,000 immigrants were settled on the land in this way before and after the First World War. To a large extent, this initiative was a terrible failure. Most of the farms were too small and the farms were too poorly resourced to last very long. So between the two world wars, approximately half of the first settlement farmers walked out their properties and never came back. Those that remained on the land were joined by a second small wave of sort of settlers after World War II. The farm problem was really a small farm problem and a poor farm problem. Throughout the 1960s, Australian agricultural economists wrote that very small farm enterprises face severe problems with poor earnings, tax liabilities, and problems with succession. A small farm might support one or two people, but not multiple generations of the same family, and cash was always in short supply. When family members worked on a farm for low pay or no pay at all, they often did so on the tacit understanding that inheriting the family farm would compensate them for their unpaid work. To them, the inheritance didn't represent an unearned windfall. It was more like delayed earnings for the work that they'd done in the past. Losing the farm, the home, and the livelihood to the tax collector is definitely not fair to them. Farm incomes vary a lot, and about 1/3 of farm businesses reporting low, very low earnings will belong to poverty. Three concurrent trends in the post-war decades brought farmer activism to a head in the 1960s. There was a long, slow cost price squeeze in the agricultural sector. And as technology and productivity improved, especially in large farm holdings, world commodity prices stagnated and profits fell. This was worse for small farmers who lacked the capital to expand or to adopt them. Second, there was high land price inflation, especially on the period bridge. This meant that the market value and the taxable value of deceased farm estate could be very, very high in comparison to its actual lending capacity. And third, over the same period, farmers' organisations continued to amalgamate, to become better resourced and more organised, and to improve their political lobbying efforts. They were well equipped to make such developments, and they did this quite frequently. So in this sort of last substantial part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on three separate processes of change, one long and two short, each of which contributed to the demise of Australia's inheritance taxes. The policy regime, or what we might call policy set, includes things like legislative instruments, administrative infrastructure, and stable relationships between stakeholders. The policy regime might sometimes come about suddenly in response to a crisis, an unexpected shock, or it might erode slowly as the policy loses effectiveness or outlivs its purpose. If we focus on the events of the 1970s, we miss a longer process of erosion that became there. That is the gradual erosion of the importance of taxes. In response to taxpayer hardship, the state governments gave tax concessions to widows and farmers starting from the late 1950s. In this chart, we can see state-level death duty revenues plotted as a percentage of consolidated revenue from the mid-1950s to the mid-1980s. And I've arranged these into three separate pairs of states so that you can see them clearly. As Queensland and Western Australia, whose coalition governments were the first to abolish the taxes, New South Wales and Victoria, the wealthiest states, which had the highest economic reliance on the tax revenue and took a very long time to phase the taxes out. And South Australia and Tasmania, both relatively poor recipient states, whose Labor governments were committed to retaining the tax duties but were defeated in abolition by the Liberal Party, which then abandoned them. In Queensland, women were poor and farmers had strong political connections with the Queensland Country Party. The abolition process revolved around a long partisan battle of wills between Country Party premiers and a series of Liberal Party treasurers who gave increasingly generous concessions to surviving spouses but resisted full abolition. The Queensland Premier Joe Peterson finally gained the upper hand in 1976, and the Liberal Party treasurer resigned from the government soon afterwards. In Western Australia, in contrast, both Liberal and Labor governments awarded tax concessions to surviving spouses well before senior members ever came on the scene. People in government recognised perfectly well that widows struggled when their husbands died, especially when the taxes were paid on the matrimonial home. The situation changed in 1977 when the Liberal Party under Sir Charles Court, failed to gain control of both houses of Parliament in the state election. The only way to have control over the upper house was to govern in coalition with the Country Party. The Country Party then coerced Charles Court into agreeing to abolish the death taxes as a condition of maintaining the coalition. This had nothing to do with fear of capital flight to Queensland. But do know that Court didn't raise the abolition bill until after the federal government had passed its own legislation. In the wealthier states, New South Wales and Victoria, farmers were numerous and well organised, and women were relatively wealthy to those in the other states, compared to those in the other states. In New South Wales, the Liberal government under Robert Askin initially rejected the idea of tax concessions for farmers, but the government became more sympathetic as the downturn worsened, and Askin decided to introduce increasingly generous tax rebates on deceased farm states. By 1974, conditions had changed quite a lot. The New South Wales budget was in very severe deficit, and the women's lobby had drawn so much attention to the harsh treatment of widows that the government was obliged to shift its focus away from farmers. The new Labor leader, Neville Brand, had a very strong working relationship with women's groups and promised to exempt marital property from taxation if elected. Brand's Labor government came to office in May 1976. The Labor government's bill for the exemption of marital property passed in the lower house, but was amended in the upper house. An extra clause was added to the bill, which was a peculiarity only permissible in New South Wales. And this stipulated that the death duties were to be phased out altogether. And Ray was trapped. He couldn't fulfil his promise on marital property without abandoning taxes altogether. But they were phased out over a very long period because the budget was in very bad shape and the Treasury still needed the revenue. So again, the end of the death duties in New South Wales had nothing to do with capital flight to Queensland. In Victoria, in the early 1960s, Liberal Premier Henry Bolte introduced tax concessions on deceased public states and also on marital property. When the rural prices worsened, rebates on farm states were increased, and then Bolte was succeeded by Liberal Premier Dick Hamer. Hamer didn't address the death duties until 1976 when he promised also to exempt marital property. This happened quite quickly without much fuss, and it seems to have been just a tokenistic response to a sort of broader movement against gender equality, the tax system. The Victorian budget was very deeply in deficit at this time, and although Hamer was very strongly critical of inheritance taxation and favoured abolition, he never ever moved to initiate the process. It wasn't until 1981, after Hamer's resignation, that the new Liberal Premier, Lindsay Thompson, announced a gradual abolition of Victorian death duties, 1/3 at a time, as the budget allowed, ending on December 1953. Now, South Australia and Tasmania were different again. South Australian farmers got major tax concessions from the state government in 1959. There weren't many changes in the 1960s, but in the 1970s, South Australians were governed by the Labor Party under Tom Tunstall, Dunstan ran a very socially progressive government that responded to female economic disadvantage and emphasised the importance of a fair, progressive and redistributive tax regime. In contrast, the Liberal Party emphasised the needs of family businesses, farmers, and the dangers of capital flight out of South Australia. In 1976, Dunstan committed both to exempting marital property from death duties and retaining the balance of the taxes and a socially just redistributive measure. By 1978, the duties represented just 1%, barely 1% of consolidated revenue. So we could see their retention almost as a kind of symbolic gesture towards egalitarian principles. Des Corcoran then eventually replaced Dunstan and was defeated at election at the end of 1979. The Liberal Party government, under Premier David Tonkin, promptly abolished what remained of death duties in South Australia. There was a very similar sequence of events in Tasmania. Over the 1970s, the Labor government increased concessions on marital and deceased power states, but didn't intend to abandon taxes altogether. By 1982, concessions and rebates had reduced the death duty revenue to less than 1% of consolidated revenue. When Labor lost office in 1982, the Liberal government under Bob Gray also abolished the taxes. In all these examples, we can see a long and fairly steady erosion of the economic importance of the tax revenue. In political science, we can call this a self-eroding causal process in which each successive step makes the policy regime a little bit weaker than was before. As long as the inheritance tax revenue provided substantial revenues to governments, abandonment just wasn't economically feasible. But when those revenues were greatly reduced, or abandonment or retention became more of a matter of partisan choice, and this is especially clear in the examples of the non-coalition states. So I'll talk now about two shorter processes, the amplification of activism and a separate sequence of events shaped by political relationships. The first of these we could call a self-amplifying causal process. It begins with the election of Sydney Negus to the federal Senate in 1970. And this event demonstrated for the very first time that people were prepared to vote on issues of tax reform. It shifted the tax reform debate onto the public policy agenda where it had never been before. Now, this is actually very well known, but Negus's electoral success prompted the launch of the Senate Standing Committee inquiry into the death duties. This, together with the Asprey inquiry, profoundly, if temporarily, changed the conditions under which interest groups and activists could express their concerns to government. Previously, there were no formal communication structures through which individual taxpayers could convey their grievances, no long-standing Senate committees and no statutory bodies. The launch of these two inquiries prompted interest groups and activists to consolidate their concerns and to articulate the possibility and submissions and testimony. The publicity surrounding the inquiries and the arguments coming out of them raised public awareness of tax issues and prompted further tax reform activism and further proliferation of activist groups. Now, the second of these two processes is more correctly defined as a reactive process in which the actions of some government actors can prompt a chain of responses in others and not necessarily all in the same jurisdiction. So every historian knows the problem of infinite regress. That is the question of how far back into history we must go to understand a chain of events. I could go all the way back to the 1850s on this, but we're lacking time. So I'm just going to begin in 1975 with the new Fraser government and the idea of this new federalism. Promises of smaller government and lower taxes, accompanied by an austerity budget and a very firm expectation that the state governments would limit their spending and raise as much of their own revenue as possible. So according to what I've seen in archive, because I think it is very highly likely that Fraser actually intended to abolish the state duties as soon as the budget was, and he definitely didn't expect that the state governments would ban theirs. So when Bill Gibson announced in March 1976 that he was going to override the Queensland Treasurer and abolish the Queensland death duties, Fraser was really quite infuriated and embarrassed. First of all, Bjelke Petersen's actions went directly against Fraser's big fiscal planning. And second, the end of the death duty in Queensland would trigger an automatic rise in the federal estate duty because of particular concession decline. This was very politically embarrassing for a government that had been promising no taxes, but there was really nothing Fraser could do about it. Federal estate taxes were then higher in Queensland than in other states. So at the June 1976 Premier's Conference, where financial arrangements and revenue sharing was discussed in more detail, Fraser angrily berated Bjelke Petersen and threatened them to withhold grant monies from the other states if they decided to destroy their own sources of revenue. And this goes some way towards explaining why state leaders didn't move towards full abolition until after the federal government had done so. They didn't want to risk their own grant monies from the federal government, and they also didn't want the federal estate duties to increase in their particular jurisdiction. The decision to finally abandon the federal estate duty was made by an ad hoc committee appointed to formulate and cost election promises for the 1977 federal election. Of the committee's 6 members, the Treasurer, Philip Lynch, was the only one who had never expressed any hostility to the estate duties. The others were all confirmed abolitionists, and it's really no surprise that they decided to go ahead and abolish at that time. Once the election was won, the legislation was passed to end the taxes, and then the state Liberal leaders adopted full abolition as standard Liberal Party policy. So you can see now that the combined effects of these 3 causal processes determine the pace and timing of the abolition of states' inheritance taxes. So there are lots of moving parts to this story, and it's hard to keep on top of them all, and I haven't even given you all that much detail. But I've attempted to bring everything together here into a single chart just to provide you with a kind of final overview of the reasons why the inheritance taxes finally failed. We can trace this back to 3 separate policy decisions made by the federal government around about the same time back in the Federation period. There was the decision to institute a federal and state duty, which complicated the tax system and shaped fiscal relationships between national and sub-national governments. The federal estate duty was never actually intended to cause hardship. It's progressive, including the tax-free threshold and reduced rates for widows and dependent children. The reasons that it did contribute hardship can be attributed to those 2 other policy decisions. First, the decision to institute the Melbourne wage and restrict women's earnings and employment opportunities. This guaranteed more or less the financial vulnerability of a large class of women, lower to middle class women, whose earnings were restricted and who were likely to be widowed with relatively few savings of their own. That took time for this class of people to develop and for this trials to be organised. Second, the decision to commit to the closer settlement schemes initiated by the pre-Federation governments. This eventually created a class of small family farmers who never amassed enough liquid assets to pay taxes on the transfer of the farm on its own time. It also took some time for this class of people to develop into a politically influential interest group. Taxpayer hardship prompted further developments. The erosion of the economic importance of taxes through increased concessions and rebates and an escalation in tax reform activism. And these, in combination with specifically partisan choices, finally led to abolition. So we're going to fast forward now through about 4 decades since the abolition of the taxes. And here we are with lots of public attention to the battery introduction. So since the publication of the Henry Tax Review, there has been a measurable increase in calls for the introduction of inheritance taxes in Australia. Many of these come from academic economists who cite both economic principles and the bad effects of growing economic inequality. Thomas Piketty's book Capital in the 21st Century, published 10 years ago now, also drew attention to the bad effects of uncontrolled inheritance, and Piketty himself suggested that inherited wealth should once more be taxed in Australia. Now, Of course, not everybody agrees with this position. Anyone who followed the 2019 federal election would be aware of the fake news anti-death tax scare campaign conducted by Labor's opponents in order to damage Labor's financial and credentials. We had people in government, including Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson, spreading misinformation about Labor's intentions, and we had trucks driving around the streets like mobile billboards painted with slogans like "Labor will tax you to death." Just a few weeks ago, we had the Herald Sun newspaper reporting on increases in the fees charged by the Victorian government for processing probate applications. The headline on the front page was "Taxed to Death" in large capital letters. The article cites the former Victorian Liberal leader Michael O'Brien, a former barrister and former advisor to Bill Costello, and the content of the article appears to me to be designed to mislead and to turn public opinion against any kind of increase in government fees by equating them with death taxes. So the persistence of this kind of behaviour does invite the question of whether reintroduction is actually politically feasible. And I can't give you a yes or no answer to this question, but I can draw your attention to some of the different components of political feasibility. So first of all, reintroduction, I think, is technically feasible, given the government institutions that we have in place. There's nothing in the Constitution to prevent it. Contemporary governments have very sophisticated administrative machinery, and computing power far superior to what was available in the 1970s. From a taxpayer perspective, electronic and online tax tools make personal tax compliance much easier than it used to be. But on the other hand, tax minimisation tools are also very sophisticated, and we need to consider whether avoidance would be a serious problem. Second, we should probably consider whether any particular social or occupational groups are likely to be still disadvantaged by this type of tax, and if so, whether this is likely to result in serious anti-tax activism or breaches of, say, principles of horizontal and vertical equity to satisfy the demands. And in the historical account I just related to you, there were two main groups that suffered hardship. So marriage patterns are different now, and not everyone is married, stays in long partnerships, but we do still have a persistent gender earnings gap, persistent gender wealth gap. Women still live longer than men in Australia, and patterns of inheritance are still likely to be gendered to at least some degree. Family farm enterprises haven't disappeared yet, and they're still prone to bad seasons of financial failure, and farm succession is still a very fraught issue. And even though Australians are one of the most urbanised peoples on earth, they still maintain a strong cultural attachment to the ideals of the family farm. Now, I always really hate to venture on the subject of political will because it's really complex and I can't explain very much in the time that we have left. But the political will of policymakers to initiate change depends partly on their perceptions of public support or public resistance. And this is especially true when support or resistance are likely to influence the voter behaviour and election results. And as we've seen recently, public support for any policy initiative can be strengthened or weakened by illegitimate means of persuasion, the exploitation of ignorance, and the propagation of misinformation and falsehoods. And as long as this type of persuasion is facilitated by news media and social media, it's going to be quite hard to educate the public sufficiently well to enable a calm and reasonable debate. So on that basis, I'd say that the political will to introduce inheritance taxes in the foreseeable future is pretty low, maybe even non-existent. But in those circumstances can change. Fiscal crises in the past have facilitated the introduction of new taxes, and they may do so again. Now, it's not that I'm hoping for a fiscal crisis or anything like that. I just wanted to leave open the possibility that the exercise of political will might one day be founded on good factual information and broad community debate across the well-educated public. And that really does conclude the presentation. So I'm going to hand back to Miranda now to moderate question time and further discussion. So thanks very much for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much for that, Karen. That's a wonderful historical exploration, and you sort of realise, I guess it's been so many decades now since the era of abolition. Some of us were young people at the time when there were still estate taxes in Australia, but perhaps most of us don't remember. We're not working in practice at the time. Don't remember what it was like. We saw those downward charts, the share of revenue declining from sort of 4 or 5% of total tax collections in those states down to sort of close to 1 or below. And now the tax context more generally has changed. What about the relative importance of other taxes? How are they doing if we think about reintroduction here?
Okay, thanks for the question, Dan. Yeah, those charts that I put up earlier show the inherent tax revenue as a percentage of consolidated revenue. That's a combination of tax revenue and grants from the federal government. So I think you're asking about the introduction and also the status of some of the other taxes that our government's levy at the moment. Fortunately, I actually have looked at some recent tax records to answer that question for myself. There are some other taxes being levied at the moment which people consider to be quite important taxes, which actually don't pay very much revenue. One of those is the resource rent tax, which I had a look at quite recently, and that's still bringing in less than 1% of federal government revenue. But people seem to think that it's still actually quite important that we levy that tax as a kind of measure towards reducing or mitigating environmental harms. So on that basis, I don't think it's impossible that the government could reintroduce a tax, an inheritance tax, even if it doesn't actually bring in very much revenue, if the political will is strong enough and it was seen as being quite an important egalitarian justice measure. I'm not sure if I'm quite answering the question.
I suppose the question in effect was, is the government getting enough out of the income tax and the consumption? Why the government worry that it's got to find more money? You know, there's loads. I don't want to make the question too long, but
yeah, no, quite right. Okay, foreign debt's pretty high at the moment, and all governments need to raise some revenue to take care of foreign debt and such run the basic functions of government. Debt's really high at the moment, and a lot of that debt was taken out over the COVID crisis when there were really severe financial constraints on business and economic activity. I'd say it's important to keep looking for sources of revenue, but the other thing is that it's important to actually have quite a broad tax base, at least quite a big spread of taxes, so that if one source of revenue dries up and fails, you've got others to rely on. Economists also like to have a mixture of progressive and regressive taxes. Progressive ones might be more socially just, but they're a bit harder to sell, whereas regressive taxes maybe not so great in terms of justice, but easy to hide in the price of goods, and so less politically intrusive. So the good reasons to have a really broad mix of taxes, and this is one of the reasons why we ended up with the GST back in about 2000. And quite a lot of academic economists are now suggesting that we should bring back inheritance taxes to take a bit of the pressure off the income tax, which is still the biggest source of tax revenue. That's what it is.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more.
Another one in the room, and then I'll come on back.
So thanks for dispelling the myth in my head that it was all about competition and race and what, or the states taking out their inheritance taxes. But if we're talking about reintroduction, would it be harder for a state to reintroduce, for a state to be a first mover and introduce its own? Do you see this as being a federal move, if anything?
I'm going to just repeat the question briefly.
Yes. The question is, if we were to look seriously at reintroduction, would it be easy for a state government to do it or for a federal government to do it? And would one be that now? I think that's the question.
Yeah, what's most politically feasible?
What's the most feasible? There's an economist called Saul Islake, who is now based at the University of Tasmania, who released a paper just a few years ago suggesting that the Tasmanian government ought to reintroduce inheritance taxes, which would be good for the Tasmanian economy. Personally, I think it would be probably easier for a state government to do it, because really big contentious policy changes are sometimes easier to initiate at state level than they are at federal level. But personally, I think it would be better if reintroduction were to take place at the federal level, so that some of those, interstate competitive issues would be avoided. With regard to the rest of the line, it can look a little bit that way, the abolition process. But I also have to say that once marital property was being exempted, starting in Queensland, there was also a little bit of a race to the top going on, because once the word was out that surviving spouses, widows in particular, were being treated very harshly in the tax regime, as soon as Queensland had done that, all of the other states were kind of jumping up and saying, oh, me too, care about widows. So it wasn't totally a race to the bottom in that regard. But yes, I think reintroduction is possibly more feasible at state level, but personally I would prefer to have it that way.
So I'm very struck by the gender aspect of your research and the kind of combination of resonance of the different reform groups, the farmers and the feminists, to put it that way. But I think the women's electoral lobby is sort of initiating in the 70s, and this being one of their first campaigns, they're a stalwart of that sort of gender equality narrative in Australia the last 50 years. That is really fascinating how those things layer on each other. We've got a question in the chat, which really is a serious sort of practical question. Wouldn't most non-housing wealth be moved into family trusts, at least by the wealthy? It is my understanding that the taxes did have provisions about trusts, but they may not have done that very well. I don't know if you've got a response to that.
Yes, that is a really great comment and a great question. The issue of family trusts is a very serious one. They weren't quite so widespread back in the 1960s and 70s. But I think they are probably much more widespread now. And so I think that's going to be hard to avoid if we're going to do trust law. The other complication that's actually arisen recently, which has just come to my attention from one of my students actually, is that quite a number of family farmers, especially in Victoria, are starting to shift their assets into self-managed super funds, which further complicates the question of how she owns the assets of this area and how taxes are levied on them. So yes, I do think that anybody who wants to reintroduce the taxes has to give some very serious thought to trust law and whether that can be modified or circumvented in some way.
And we've just got another comment by Garrison online. Thanks, Mark. Perhaps more of a comment and a question pointing out of US experience with its estate tax and avoidance there, but also the way that it potentially leads to greater philanthropy. And there is substantial philanthropy in the US, as we know, and is it their estate tax settings that are leading to that? If we might want to encourage that here. I don't know if philanthropy was ever an issue in the older estate taxes in Australia.
No, good comment. The situation in the United States was and remains quite different to the situation in Australia. We don't have such a big tradition of philanthropy here as they do in the United States. There was always provision in the state tax statutes to allow tax concessions on donations to charitable foundations, educators, hospitals, and scientific organisations. But I did have a quick look at some of the data, and from what I can see, those donations were actually never particularly large. The estate taxes also interacted with the gift taxes, which were instituted around about the time of the Second World War as a means of stopping people from avoiding the death duties by giving away their wealth should be there. I don't know if that's the case in the United States or not. I suppose
I think they have an estate and gift tax.
Okay. The biggest, the most important piece of literature on the federal state duties is a book called Death by 1,000 Cuts by Michael Mason in Europe. And this covers the anti-tax reform campaign against the federal estate duties. Very interesting book, I think that would read. But it doesn't cover anything that happened at the state level, so I can't really comment on that, unfortunately.
I've got a more practical question, I guess, about the old estate taxes. What sort of, they were at quite high rates, as well as the base, including the home and so on, with some thresholds. Do you know what the rates were? Not to put you on the spot in terms of actual numbers.
No, actually, I can't really give you detail because they changed over the course of time, and I can't remember all the rates. What I can tell you is that the federal estate duties started at a different tax-free threshold compared to the states, which will vary a little bit, and the federal estate duties were much more steeply progressive than the state taxes. But when you looked at them in combination, they all kind of ended up the same in all the states. Not at the low levels, that's where they vary quite a bit, but at the high levels, they were pretty much the same. So they kind of affected each other because the rate structures were a bit different. So it's competitive. Yeah, but some people do complain that the tax rates at the state level were so different that it just wasn't really fair one state or another. But that was at the very lowest levels, and at the highest levels.
You mean at lower estate size?
Lower estate size, yes. But I just thought there's something to do with that thing about family trusts and property ownership. And that was one of the things I found in the data was that the proportion of assets in the deceased estate that was actually realty, that's real estate, varied quite a lot depending on the size of the deceased estate. So in the bottom 50% of taxable estates, there was a larger proportion of assets devoted to real estate, and that was usually somebody's house or somebody's farm. But up in the very top 10%, 1%, there wasn't that much real estate. The proportion was actually much less. It was usually liquid assets like shares. So we want to talk about taxing the family home, and we don't want to make it too regressive. We have to bear in mind that the smaller deceased estates actually comprise a much higher proportion of real estate, and that's usually the house that somebody's been living in.
Okay, well, I'm conscious of our time. Thanks very much again, Karen. I'd ask people in the room and online. Thank you very much. We will record the seminar and make the slides available as part of that process as well. Okay, thanks again, Karen.